Doing it. I want you to think this morning about how you think about the world. It's a thing that can be often hidden from us because we can't imagine another way of doing it until we hear of another person or get to know them deeply and realise how different their basic assumptions can be. It's the sort of thing that travel to foreign climes opens our eyes to, or when we meet people quite unlike us. I want to introduce to you one person this morning. Her name is Temple Grandin. She's a professor of animal sciences at Colorado State University. She's had a successful career consulting on livestock handling equipment design and animal welfare, and she is autistic, a prominent author and speaker on both autism and animal behaviour. And I became rather fascinated on her when I was studying the relationship between autism and our Christian faith. She talks a bit about how she sees the world, and when I read these words, it was an eye-opening experience for me about the way in which I see the world and how I just assumed that that was how everyone saw the world. She says, many people see a generalized, generic church rather than specific churches and steeples when they read or hear the word steeple. Their thought patterns move from a general concept to specific examples. My thinking pattern, though, she says, always starts with specifics and works towards generalization. Unlike those of most people, my thoughts move specific images to generalizations and concepts. In fact, she talks on how for much of her life she found generalization just an impossible task. She says her concept of dogs is inextricably linked to every dog I've ever known. And she said for the first 30 or 40, she had to be told every single time, this too is a dog. Because if it didn't match exactly the specific examples she'd known before, there was no way for her to compute that this was a part of that set. Many of us tend to reason in the opposite way. We generalize, which is, of course, a handy tool for our limited brains, but it's also the basis of stereotyping. We collapse all individuals in one particular category into a general form. And we know that the vile outcome of this is so often the oppression of those groups. Acknowledgement of different families really existing with difference, and yet acknowledgement of our unity is what our scriptures are getting at today. From whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name. Our differentiality, our specificity, our uniqueness, and yet our unity from all receiving our name from the same Heavenly Father. But what is it that unites us? Well, principally, it's our heavenly origin, our link to God. And for us today, that plays out most clearly in our Eucharistic worship. That's our richest sign of unity, when we gather as one family, one body, around one table to receive the Eucharist. And even the language that we use in this service points again to that. Though we are many, though we are unique, specific individuals, yet we are one body because we all share in one bread. Not destroying our individuality, but nevertheless asserting our unity. We heard in John's Gospel the story familiar to us as the feeding of the 5,000, and this is the first of 5 weeks where you're going to hear continually through chapter 6 of John's Gospel. It starts off with the feeding of 5,000, and then it goes on as Jesus explains to his disciples the importance of the Eucharist. There is in John no Last Supper. it's missing and surprisingly absent from the end of the story. It's not there in the Passion narrative. And that's because for John, this chapter is what serves in its place. Here Jesus will explain over the coming weeks that he himself is the bread of life. And it's worth taking into account this first part, this feeding miracle, to see in what ways we are to understand Jesus as the one who feeds us on our journey. The first thing to note is John's little detail that the Passover is near. This isn't just to help us align ourselves within the year. This is to offer to us the image of the Eucharist understood through the lens of the Passover. That is, a meal celebrated in the home in remembrance of the way in which the angel of death passed over the Israelite houses and spared the firstborn of the Israelites when they were in captivity in Egypt. It also signifies their salvation, their final flight from Egypt under the persecution of Pharaoh and the crossing of the Red Sea that followed. Similarly, the Eucharist is our collective remembrance of our salvation, in which Christ's death and resurrection restore us to the Father and liberate us. If we see the world as what might happen and what we might do, then the Eucharist reminds us that it is in fact principally a question of what God has already done. It draws us from always looking forward to what the future might hold, to remember that we are grounded in God's works done already in salvation history. The story goes on, and here is a wonderful detail where you can see the date of our translation that we use. The disciples cry out to Jesus, it would cost more than £20, they say, to feed these 5,000 people. Well, you're lucky if you can get a Boots meal deal for £20 these days. The better translation would be 6 months' wages. That would be a translation that's always going to hold water and not be subject to inflation. So the disciples really say something like it would cost 6 months' wages to feed all these people. And they were all satisfied by the end. It's abundant. It reflects God's abundance of love, of mercy, and of grace. It's not because of our ability or our talent or even our piety that we're rescued, but simply because we are God's beloved children. Now, you might be gagging for a biscuit by the end of this service, and perhaps this is where our symbol breaks down a little bit, loses some of its symbolic power. But the Eucharist is a meal in which we ought to feel satisfied. It should sate our spiritual hunger. It is enough. If the way we see the world is as a place of scarcity, then the Eucharist reminds us that God creates abundantly. And we hear at the end of this feeding, there are 12 baskets left over. There's more than enough for the 5,000 who are gathered. There's nothing miserly about this meal. There's plenty for everyone and more left over. The best way I've ever heard this explained was at a sermon I heard at London Pride a couple of years ago. At the end of the Pride Festival, there's always a celebration in a church for all of the Christians at Pride, and the person who was preaching that day, she said when she was a child, they used to have for pudding on a Sunday as a special treat, a sort of canned treacle sponge pudding that you'd take it out of its can, or maybe even stick it in the oven first. I can't quite remember how she said it worked, but her point was that it didn't matter how many people came over for dinner, how many friends were around, her mum always managed to sort of cut it once more and once more, such that there was enough sponge pudding for everybody. There is enough. That means that we don't have to be careful. We don't need to store it away or treasure it up for hard times. We don't need to make sure that we've got enough just in case. There is abundance no matter how many we invite to the table. There's always more left over than we need. So if the way that we see the world is as a place where we're in competition with our neighbours, then the Eucharist reminds us that the more that we share, the more that there is. And whilst there is always an excess, it is nevertheless a precious gift. Jesus instructs the disciples, gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost. When God created, he saw that it was good. The creation is marked by his holiness, and as such we're called to treat creation with respect and to honour it in order to honour its creator. If the way we see the world is as a place that can be improved by chopping off the bruises or throwing the leftovers away, then the Eucharist reminds us that nothing and no one is beyond repair and redemption. So come to the altar today to receive Christ, his body and his blood, in the knowledge of God's great love for you. Receive from him a meal that satisfies. Leave this place knowing there is enough for everyone, for all those you meet, and love one another, for you are God's most beloved children. Amen.